A new qualifying trick with F1's 2026 engines has emerged that's annoyed Ferrari, and it comes with a very curious side effect. This is the fascinating connection between Mercedes and Red Bull getting around complicated power reduction demands of the new engines at the end of qualifying laps, and cars stopping on track or crawling with almost no power. Williams driver Alex Albon stopped on track in practice in Japan, where Mercedes' Kimi Antonelli and Red Bull's Max Verstappen were also left limping through the high-speed sweeps in the opening sector. As it turns out, Antonelli had the same problem back in Australia, but it went largely undetected, at least outside of the FIA and other manufacturers, who started to cotton on to what was happening. It's no coincidence these problems have come when the drivers backed off after completing a flying lap, and it exposes a fascinating way the engine rules are being exploited in qualifying. Mercedes and Red Bull have found a way to deploy maximum electric power for slightly longer, at the cost of going into a 60-second shutdown of the MGUK afterwards. And in certain circumstances, this leads to drivers pretty much losing their engine entirely and having to sit there just waiting for power to return. The drastic and very visible problem is a bizarre unintended consequence of what these teams are doing, and it's also a smoking gun for a way they are trying to exploit F1's complex rules around energy management as much as possible. So what's going on? F1's MGUK usage rules include a staged ramp down from full deployment to none. In the simplest terms, it usually has to be phased out 50 kilowatts at a time in 1 second intervals. So after deploying full power exiting a corner, at some point on the straight there'll be a gradual reduction in the engine's total power output. Pretty standard stuff in F1's new energy limited formula. But the Mercedes and Red Bull engine teams are able to cut the MGUK from the full 350 kilowatts to zero deployment in one go, right at the end of their qualifying laps, thereby extending the time they get full MGUK power. It doesn't change how much energy they can spend, so running at 350 kilowatts will mean they deploy for less time compared to running at gradually reducing power levels, but it is a small net lap time gain overall. What they're doing is taking advantage of a system in place that is intended for emergency use in case a problem means the MGUK must be shut off suddenly. The rules allow for a reduction in MGUK deployment at any time and of any amount. To stop teams from abusing it by exploiting it on more straights and in normal racing conditions, it comes with a 60-second lockout. If you activate this type of reduction, then the ECU locks the MGUK for at least 1 minute afterwards. Usually, this is an effective deterrent because on a normal lap, the cost of having no electric power for a full 60 seconds would be too high. However, doing it right at the end of a qualifying lap and getting a helpful power boost right on the run to the finish line is fine, as then you're just missing the MGUK for the first half of a cooldown lap or an in-lap back to the pits. This should be much less of an issue, but as we've seen, a painful problem can kick in. This trick is subtle enough that it goes under the radar in normal circumstances. Full MGUK power extension on a qualifying lap compared to a ramp down would be imperceptible to us watching, and though there would potentially be hints in the data, with superior speed in those final few meters, rival teams would not be able to easily discern the cause. In other words, this could be something that Mercedes and Red Bull were able to do undetected, except sometimes there's an extremely high price for using this trick. It's been exposed by the very visible problem of cars slowing or stopping on track. Antonelli's unbroadcast issue in FP1 in Australia was the first example, but the trio of issues in close proximity in Japan brought it to the surface. Verstappen called it a glitch when the engine revs drop too low and you don't downshift quickly enough when we asked him about it in Japan. But the more we investigated, the more interesting the answer became. What actually happens is the engine RPM drops, as does turbo boost pressure, which will already have been reduced as the cars slow down after the finish line. This is normally manageable even at reduced speed, but if a driver slows suddenly and significantly to let a faster car through and the revs drop even more, the engine loses almost all power and it is really hard to get it back. As is well established with these engines, because of the problems many have had with race starts, the big turbos struggle to run at the required speed now that the old MGUH has been removed, so there is a horrible lag problem. Normally this gets filled in with electric power from the MGUK, but in these circumstances that can't happen because the MGUK is locked. So the engine essentially just starts limping, and bringing it back to life is a painfully slow exercise. It is possible to build the power up very gradually with a small amount of throttle to spin the turbo, but this is counterintuitive for drivers who initially think their throttle pedal isn't responding. You can see this in Antonelli's throttle trace from Australia, where he's stabbing the pedal and it has no response. This doesn't help at all. It's a bit like if you've ever tried to start your road car, the ignition won't fire and you flood the engine by pumping the throttle. And it's clearly not something that's easy for the drivers to react to naturally themselves. When it happened the second time, in Japan, Antonelli radioed his team to inform them, "I have the issue man, no boost," and was told just a gradual pedal application in response. But as building boost pressure gradually on throttle can take a while anyway, it can just be a case of waiting for the 60-second lockout to end so the MGUK is available again. That's usually 20 or 30 seconds or so from the problem starting, because a good chunk of the 60-second lockout has usually passed by the time the car gets into trouble. It's not a Control-Alt-Delete moment so much as just waiting for the power to return. Where this story gets more interesting than a technical quirk with a weird consequence is the whole saga is yet another case of Ferrari being annoyed by its rivals. And while this trick is something Red Bull has engaged in too, Ferrari's annoyance really relates to Mercedes, because Mercedes is the benchmark with these rules and Ferrari has an engine deficit to eradicate if it wants to start winning races in 2026. Ferrari and Mercedes have clashed several times already over the new regulations. First, Ferrari was upset with Mercedes' interpretation of the compression ratio rules. Then, Ferrari got frustrated by the successful push to change the start procedure to help those, including Mercedes, who were struggling to manage the launches given their turbo designs. Ferrari felt this was totally unnecessary, as it raised the issue of difficult starts a year ago, was told to change its engine for the rules rather than the other way around, and settled on the design it did that has potentially compromised its total performance while giving it rocket starts. So Ferrari's view is that part of its own advantage has been clipped, while Mercedes has been given an assist more than once. Now, this MGUK trick is seen by Ferrari as an example of rule exploitation the FIA probably should clamp down on, but it wants clarification on it either way. It accepts that what Mercedes and Red Bull are doing is within the rules, but was not the intention. So Ferrari wants to know why it's allowed and if it will continue to be allowed. We don't know if that means that Ferrari has tried to replicate it yet, but other manufacturers have looked into it. But building it into the energy management systems without triggering unintended consequences is difficult, especially if they only found out about it in Australia and haven't had a huge amount of time to figure out how to comply with the rules and make it work safely. Calling all motorsport fans, have you heard of Silverstone Woodlands? It's the biggest and closest campsite to Silverstone Circuit, the ultimate base for the Formula 1 British Grand Prix weekend. And if you're booking your stay, we've got an exclusive 15% off for you. Camp right next to the action and do race weekend properly. Big screens showing every race, live music into the night, incredible street food and thousands of fans all in one place. Camping or glamping, whatever your vibe, we've got you covered. Use code THERACE15 at checkout to save 15% on your booking. Hit the link in the description to lock it in. The complexity and the potential safety implications of this trick is a trade-off that even those pioneering it aren't quite getting right. This is most useful on circuits where there is a slightly longer run to the finish line, and where eking out that fraction more at full power deployment, rather than it ramping down, can be worth a small but not insignificant lap time gain. At Suzuka it was relevant because the run out of the chicane is a reasonable deployment zone, about 50 metres longer than at Shanghai for example. However, the track layout also plays a part in how big the consequence could be. The long run to turn 1 at Suzuka is around 700 metres, which is ample time for a car slowing down after a qualifying lap to be caught by another. The opening sector at Suzuka is surprisingly narrow too, which means getting out of the way urgently is essential. This resulted in Albon having to basically stop at the apex of turn 1, and Verstappen and Antonelli slowing right down before the sweeps, because they've been caught at very awkward moments. And assuming it's even possible to stop the engine dying down too much in those specific scenarios by quickly downshifting, it's clearly not automatic enough for the drivers yet to do it by default. That's why the FIA is known to have had some communication with Mercedes about its use of this engine mode at Suzuka after the issues in practice. The governing body knew that it was possible this 350 kilowatt cutoff could be exploited, hence adding in the 60-second lockout as a deterrent. But even though it was not the intention for this to be used competitively, the FIA accepts that the rules do allow it to be the case, so its current stance is that it can be done as long as it's safe. Multiple issues for different cars at Suzuka alerted the FIA to a potential problem, and after however much discussion took place, we understand Mercedes opted not to continue using this deployment trick over the rest of the Japan weekend. And privately, there is known to be a feeling among some that it might not be worth the risk anyway. It's being done in the pursuit of marginal gains, and it obviously brings a benefit, but it's not the silver bullet behind Mercedes having the best engine, for example. So if there is too much of a likelihood of engines uncontrollably shutting down, and even worse creating a safety risk, it might not even take FIA intervention for this to stop happening. It might just be quietly dropped by the teams using it anyway. What's more likely for now is that Mercedes and Red Bull will work to understand the circumstances better, tune their drivers to detect what's really going on as much as possible, and bring this trick back wherever it offers a slight performance edge. In that case, look out for cars stopping or suddenly going extremely slowly, and for whether Ferrari opts to kick up a fuss afterwards.